This week on Jerusalem Dateline, the Afghanistan pullout seen as a fulfillment of Islamic prophecy. What does that mean for Jerusalem? And Hamas gets a crippling blow from a former ally in its war against Israel. Plus, another kind of battle as doctors and experts search for remedies to help end the pandemic. And a visit to a hidden treasure in Jerusalem's Old City. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Many observers in the West see the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan as a geopolitical disaster and also a tragedy for those left behind under Taliban rule. For the other side, the impact has a different meaning. While seen as a military victory by the Taliban and other Muslims, there's also an element of fulfilling Islamic prophecy that sets its sights on Jerusalem. The Taliban Twitter page carried this message: black flags will rise from Khorasan and nothing will be able to return them. The Taliban are now flying their white flags, but black flags come during a time of war.
This is very important. I haven't heard this talked about in the mainstream media at all. But if we look at some of the main end-time prophecies within Islam, I mean, one of the biggest prophecies, there's a prophecy that says armies carrying black flags will come from the area of the east or Khorasan.
Khorasan is an ancient land that includes modern northwest Pakistan, eastern Iran, and all of Afghanistan. Joel Richardson wrote the best-selling book, The Islamic Antichrist. He explained the importance of this prophecy on the recent CBN webinar, Afghanistan, What's Next After the U.S. Pullout?
It says an army will come from Khorasan carrying black flags. And then it says this: if you see them, give them your allegiance, even if you have to crawl over ice, because this is the army of the Mehdi, or in English, you could just say the Mahdi, the vice regent of Allah. So this is one of their biggest end-time prophecies.
Afghanistan is the heart of Khorasan.
Sheikh Imran Hossein, a Muslim expert on Islamic prophecies, connects the U.S. pullout in Afghanistan to this prophecy.
What is happening in Afghanistan is validating the prophecy of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, that a Muslim army is destined to come out of Afghanistan, of Khorasan, and no one will be able to stop it until it reaches Jerusalem.
The prophecy points here to Jerusalem as the final goal of the Mahdi's army, where it expects to plant its flags there on the Temple Mount.
Jerusalem is the barometer. Jerusalem is the epicenter. Jerusalem is the goal. That's Satan's target. That's where Jesus is going to return, reestablish the throne of his father David, and rule the world from. Satan's very well aware of that.
While some Muslims may not know about these prophecies or even agree with them, Richardson says the world should understand how parts of the Islamic world perceive the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan.
As Christians, of course, we don't give any credence to Islamic prophecy. It's not inspired by God. It's largely inspired by Satan. But the point is this: it gives us a glimpse into the playbook of the enemy. Muslims, many Muslims that are very, very well aware of their own prophecies, they see this as the fulfillment of Islamic prophecy. And there's power in prophecy. It's a tremendous recruiting tool.
The Taliban see themselves as this army, and the ISIS branch in Afghanistan calls itself ISIS-K, K for Khorasan. Given the unfolding developments, it's likely Afghanistan will once again become a magnet for Muslims around the world to join the black flags of Khorasan. While radicals made headway in Afghanistan, a major blow to Hamas, as the government of Sudan, once an ally of the terrorist group, seized a number of its financial assets. The move cripples its efforts to wage war on Israel. It's also symbolic of larger changes taking place in the Middle East. It represents a significant shift in the region and more evidence the Abraham Accords continue to bear fruit. While Hamas in the Gaza Strip remains a formidable military foe to Israel, the decision by Sudan strikes at the way Hamas finances their terror state.
It's a blow to Hamas' financial capabilities, which is important by itself because Sudan was a major center where Hamas economic activity was taking place. and was the main source of income for the organization, for this movement.
Retired General Yossi Kuperwasser is the former head of Israel's military intelligence. He says Sudan, once a state sponsor of terror, is shifting its alliance to the West.
It's important for Sudan because it's a message that it is really trying to get rid of its past as a hub for Hamas activity and Hamas financial activity.
At one time, Sudan was a hub for radical Islam, even harboring Osama bin Laden in the 1990s. But in 2019, the Sudanese overthrew dictator Omar al-Bashir, and the government began to change. Last year, President Trump paved the way for a Sudan-Israel peace when he removed Sudan from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Kuperwasser says the Abraham Accords played an enormous part in Sudan's decision.
Definitely. I think when Sudan decided to embark on this initiative and join the Abraham Accords, they knew what is the price. I mean, I think that the Americans and maybe even the Israelis were delivering this message. You cannot have the Abraham Accords on the one hand and keep supporting Hamas on the other.
The world continues to watch Israel's fight in the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. After 9 months into a massive vaccination campaign, the country is relying heavily on its Green Pass, which allows those vaccinated to have greater access to public venues. This growing dependence is causing distress among some Israelis. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett sounded positive as statistics show Israel recovering from its fourth surge of the pandemic.
In the battle against the coronavirus, it seems at this point that we have the upper hand. All parameters show a gradual decrease in morbidity. The confirmed cases are in decline.
Still, Bennett cautioned against relaxing preventative efforts.
Despite the overall positive direction, no one should enter into complacency facing the elusive virus. We're continuing with the campaign with our might, and we're also preparing for the next stage.
That includes a change to Israel's Green Pass. Technical difficulties postponed its launch, but only those who've received a booster or a second dose or have recovered all less than 6 months ago will qualify for the pass. Venues such as indoor restaurants, gyms, and university campuses are expected to check each patron's pass and ID. That sent protesters to the streets against the green passes and what they called forced compliance.
We are totally against any forced vaccinations or any forced medications.
Signs in car windows said, "Tomorrow it's you," and democracy is gone.
I've represented Israel across the world. I've gone on college campuses. I fought for Israel, and I'm ashamed today of what Israel is doing.
Israel began offering the Pfizer BioNTech boosters to those over 12, and more than a third of the 9 million citizens have received it, according to the health ministry. From the beginning, medical experts have had mixed reactions to the green passes. Renowned immunologist Dr. Zvi Bentwich of Ben-Gurion University is part of the Emergency Public Council for the Corona crisis.
We are not against vaccination, but we are against the usage of a measure that would cause discrimination and enforcement of measures that would impinge on basically on human rights.
Professor David Enoch at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem disagrees.
When done properly, it does not violate human or civil rights. Giving at least a fairly successful vaccination effort, green passport policy is the way to do that.
Having a policy, let's say in restaurants, that everybody will wear a mask and there would be some sort of distancing, but by saying that you cannot enter a place unless you have this passport, that's a different story.
For the most part, Israelis just want life to return to normal, including allowing an unlimited number of tourists back in the country. Until then, even disagreeing medical minds will continue to look for ways to successfully prevent and treat the virus. Coming up, looking for medical options to fight the COVID-19 battle alongside vaccines. In the battle against COVID-19, most of the world has turned to vaccines as the main line of defense. Still, a number of doctors and hospitals are looking for other options that could potentially play a role in defeating this global pandemic. In the battle to defeat COVID-19, a number of treatments have seen success, such as Regeneron and remdesivir. The drug ivermectin also continues to generate interest. And while the FDA and other organizations advised against it, one Israeli doctor is reporting positive results in a clinical trial. Professor Eli Schwartz is with the Sheba Medical Center in Israel, considered one of the world's top hospitals. For decades, Professor Schwartz has traveled the world fighting outbreaks like dengue fever and Ebola. He also began the Travel Medicine and Tropical Disease Institute at Sheba. At the beginning of the pandemic, and months before any vaccine, Israel's defense ministry assigned Schwartz to find a medical solution for COVID-19.
And since ivermectin is one of the drugs that we are using in daily life in the Tropical Institute, I knew it, I know the safety profile of it. And since there were some hints of in vitro studies which show the efficacy against, specifically even against COVID-19, we decided to go for it.
That meant putting the drug through a clinical trial that lasted 10 months.
So our study, which was done here, it's a randomized controlled trial, double-blind. It's really, I would say, this is the best method that you are doing studies. And our conclusion is that it has antiviral activities.
From his international experience in the field, Schwartz knew ivermectin targeted parasites. Since its development in 1987, nearly 4 billion doses with little side effects and at low cost have protected millions of people from insidious parasitical diseases like river blindness and elephantiasis. That success won its developers the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2015. Schwartz's study made headlines in Israel when his trial showed ivermectin to also be antiviral.
So this is the first drug to show antiviral activity. And then I think there's a good reason to continue with a much more thorough investigation to see, for example, whether people who are at high risk may not deteriorate to be hospitalized, to be mechanical ventilated or to death.
Schwartz's clinical study found that by day 4, 86% of his patients who took ivermectin recovered. By day 6, 94% recovered.
The bottom line is that ivermectin decreased faster the viral load and also sterilized the culture much better compared to the placebo.
Schwartz explained to CBN News this means ivermectin killed the virus and his patients were non-infectious. Schwartz says this could save lives and reduce quarantines by days.
It's a huge change in life. It's a huge change for the patient. It's a huge change for his family. And from the economical point of view, it's a dramatic change. You know, it's how much money you can save for the economy of the country if you can shorten the isolation time.
But ivermectin is not accepted by the global health establishment. A major FDA concern is that a number of people have tried to self-medicate using a form of the drug intended for livestock.
Don't do it. There's no evidence whatsoever that that works, and it could potentially have toxicity, as you just mentioned, with people who have gone to poison control centers because they've taken the drug at a ridiculous dose and wind up getting sick.
The World Health Organization says WHO advises that ivermectin only be used to treat COVID-19 within clinical trials. The National Institutes of Health says ivermectin is not approved by the FDA for the treatment of any viral infection. Well-conducted clinical trials are needed. And for studies to be accepted by the broader medical community, it must be peer-reviewed and published in a medical journal. That's where Professor Schwartz hit a roadblock. Several journals turned him down, but one is currently reviewing his study.
It's something really very odd. I mean, in my career, I published, I think, at least 300 papers and chapters. And I never had the story that I have now with the ivermectin. I think that there is kind of international campaign anti-ivermectin. Same that we have anti-vaxxers, we have anti-ivermectin. I don't understand.
Professor Schwartz says while many health agencies want better studies, no large-scale trials on ivermectin happened until Oxford University began one in June of this year.
I mean, it took them 18 months from the beginning of the pandemic to try to do it. I mean, people dying all over the world, and you have drug under your hand, and you have to wait so long until you get any conduction of a good study.
And now Merck, which developed ivermectin, and Pfizer are in a race to produce an oral antiviral drug for COVID that some believe is what ivermectin does already.
In my view, the whole story of ivermectin is much beyond ivermectin. It's even beyond the corona. The problem is that we are in the arms of the pharma, and the pharma looking for new drugs. And therefore, all old drugs, which might be with a good potential to use it for whatever you are looking for, there's no any parents to push for it.
Professor Schwartz advocates the use of ivermectin, but also believes in the vaccine.
Most of the world still vaccine is not available. So if we have a medication which can try to reduce the magnitude of the pandemic at the meantime, that's absolutely needed. But if I have to compare vaccine and ivermectin for prevention, no doubt the vaccine, this is the international solution.
Schwartz hopes more research will prove the drug can help fight this pandemic and that it will eventually be allowed to treat patients on a widespread basis and not just within clinical trials. Up next, remembering Israel's deadliest war and the miracle of a dove. Israel marked the 48th anniversary of the start of the 1973 Yom Kippur War on October 6th, when combined Arab armies mounted a surprise attack on the holiest day of the Jewish year. More soldiers died and were injured in that war than in any of Israel's other wars. Former Israeli commander Efi Etam was sent on a daring mission to go behind enemy lines and take the Syrian division headquarters. What happened next, he says, seemed like a miracle.
I was throwing hand grenades, shooting, in the broad concrete corridors. And then when I turned behind one of the corners of the corridors, which was full of smoke and dust, I saw something coming out of the dust and the smoke towards me. I was very sure it's a Syrian soldier. I was ready to pull the trigger. And then I saw a bird coming out of the smoke. She just flew behind my head and she stood on my right shoulder. So I completed the assault and the hand grenades and everything. And when I went out of the bunker, I saw a dove, a pigeon, standing on my left shoulder. And she was very determined not to leave me. I put my hand just like that and she stood on my hand.
Despite Etam's attempts to get rid of the dove, she stayed with him and his unit for the next 10 days in some of the most intense battles of the Yom Kippur War.
Since we had that angel protecting us, none of my company soldiers was killed or wounded, and we were involved in very intensive battles. She was with us, patrolling a little bit forward, looking what's going on around, sitting here.
Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of frontline conflict, Etam and his unit were sent to the rear for a rest.
And when I put my feet down the vehicle which brought us from the front to the territory of the State of Israel, she flew away and disappeared.
Since that experience, the sense of the miraculous and God's protection has never left Etam. The same protection promised in the 23rd Psalm.
Even when I am in valley of death and evil, I'm not afraid because God is with me.
Still ahead, a special guide reveals a hidden treasure in Jerusalem. About 1 million people visited Jerusalem's Western Wall during the last 2 months of special prayers and the High Holy Days. Most people would recognize the Western Wall, or Kotel in Hebrew. But there's a hidden treasure in Jerusalem's old city called the Little Western Wall. And we have a special little guide to take us there.
We're going to go to the Little Kotel. You ready? Okay.
Well, that's one of the special treasures here in Jerusalem. That's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.